On this episode of TLC Connections, we hear from Dr. David Bronkema, professor, international development leader, and former collegiate coach who shares a leadership journey defined by open doors, unexpected detours, and meaningful relationships. From his early years living abroad to decades of academic and nonprofit service, David reflects on the setbacks that became stepping stones and how love and humility guide his approach to life and leadership. If you've ever wondered whether you're on the right path, this conversation offers clarity and encouragement. We hope you enjoy the episode.
Welcome to TLC Connections, the podcast where educators, counselors, coaches, and community leaders come together to inspire change, one connection at a time.
David, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome, GT. It's great to be here.
Hey, we're going to just jump right in.
Right.
You are, among other things, you're a professor of leadership. I guess the first question that pops in my mind is, how do you define it? And before you do, there's a quote, I forgot who said it, and I'm paraphrasing. So there's as many definitions of leadership as there are people who have tried to define it.
Right.
So there's no right or wrong answer, but I'm wondering how do you define it?
I like the definition that has the word influence in it, right? A leader is somebody who influences others, and you can take that in a number of different ways, but I think at the most basic, that's really what we're talking about, right? You can influence others through the way you behave, through the way you model things, through what you say. So I really like that, right? It's somebody that people look to because of the influence that that person has on them.
Yeah. All right. So given that definition, jumping right into kind of your personal history, you can go back as far back as you want or feel comfortable going, but who's been the most impactful leader in your life? And maybe another way to phrase it is, who has been most influential in your life?
I would have to say without a doubt would be my parents. I grew up as a missionary kid in Portugal and Italy, and just the experience that I had seeing my dad lead in a certain number of ways. He would fly back. He was so committed to the civil rights struggle. He would fly back from Europe to march with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at Selma and other places. And my mom would be a leader in the household, with us as kids, making sure we're memorizing scripture verses after dinner, things along those lines. And just growing up with a respect, right, for what they did and seeing how they went about it. So really, when you're asking me about who had the most influence in my life, it was them. And also their commitment to really be a part of the local population. They put us in local schools in Portugal and Italy. And the experience of growing up, speaking other languages, absorbing other cultures, realizing, that there are a lot of different ways of looking at the world. I don't think I could cite anybody else, right, other than my parents. Yep.
So you were in Portugal, I'm assuming in the 60s. You mentioned civil rights. So
it was in the 60s, yep. So this was when I was 5. So in 1966, we moved to Portugal, spent 5 years there. Year in furlough back in New York City, and then we went to Italy. It must have been right around 70, 71, if I remember correctly. Spent 4 years there, then came back.
So 5 years in Portugal from age 5 to 10?
Mm-hmm.
So formative years.
Very
for
formative.
sure. And did you pick up, were you fluent in Portuguese?
I actually spoke better Portuguese than English because pretty much all day we spoke Portuguese. At home we spoke English. My mom homeschooled us in terms of the U.S.-based curriculum so that we wouldn't fall behind in that. So we would attend the public schools and come home and do some more homework. Yep.
And then Italy. So how many countries have you lived in?
Well, so I've lived in Portugal and Italy, and then I spent 5 years in Honduras, so lived in those countries. Again, in each place, you just learn more things, right?
What ages were you when you lived in Honduras? Was that
Honduras was after I graduated, yeah.
Okay, so you were an adult then.
Right, so I graduated from Swarthmore College and went right down to Honduras right afterwards and spent from 83 through 88 in that country there.
So roughly 5 years in Portugal, roughly 5 or 4 in Italy,
right?
And then 5
in Honduras. Yeah.
Any particular stories you'd like to share about any of those? any like very memorable events that happened? Obviously, you remember your father coming back from marches and telling you those stories. That obviously is memorable to you because you just mentioned it. But any other?
I'll tell you a story from Italy. I mean, Honduras, that was incredibly formative, especially in terms of where God led me into work after that, but just as far as learning. But I'll share a story from Italy that I was actually just thinking about this story the other day, in part because I forget what triggered it, but sometimes I have what I call kind of these nostalgic moments for countries in which I lived in, and this was what brought this up. So we were in the public schools. I was in middle school. I believe it was it was a middle school in Italy, in Rome. We were in Rome. And I was the only American, right, in that particular school. And one day there was another American girl who came in. She was a child of a diplomat, U.S. Embassy. And I remember, wow, that's kind of neat, right? But after about a week or so in class, she said something along the lines of, this is 1970s, right? Vietnam War is going on.
Right.
She said something along the lines of, aren't you Italians glad that we rescued you in World War II?
Okay.
At which point I wanted to crawl under my desk, right? Because it was something that was said, and I don't think she meant it that way, but it was something that, to me at least, came across as quite arrogant, right? Something where, America was the first and foremost, and everybody should be thankful to us. And she didn't last very long. And that story has stuck with me, I think, because we all have our blind spots, but I think especially since I've done so much work around U.S. foreign policy in Honduras and some other places afterwards, it just struck me again that the blind spots sometimes that we have from positions of power are pretty damaging, and can be damaging not just to relationships but to a lot of people on the ground. So I hope and pray that her leaving the school led her on to better things. But that is something that I always do remember. Yeah,
I'm a little familiar with Honduras because my wife and two of my daughters have been to Honduras multiple times. I think my wife's been 4 or 5 times, and flew into
Tegucigalpa, right? The capital. That's where I lived. Yeah.
Yeah. So you lived there.
Yep.
I was going to ask you. So I know a little bit about the geography. So you lived right there in the main
I did.
city.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
And so she's spent quite a few days, 7-day trips times 4 or 5 trips.
Were these mission trips or medical trips?
Service-oriented mission
wonderful.
trips.
There were a lot of those. Yep.
Yeah. Worked with a lot of orphans, and there was an orphanage for boys out from Tegucigalpa, and the one for the girls was right in town.
Right.
But you're talking about changing perspectives for them. I mean, especially my young children. And one of the daughters went multiple times, and it really, I would say that it kind of shaped her entire life.
Right.
It living in the American bubble and getting outside of that and seeing that there's other ways of living, and people have different struggles, and we take so much for granted in the U.S. So it kind of really changed her life. So I'd ask you, in that same spirit, was there any? I'm continuing on these stories too, because I like stories, and TLC Connections is all about sharing stories. Any other stories that you'd like to share that was kind of really enlightening, transformative? You and I talked earlier about the butterfly effect, this idea of like one little small choice or connection that is made that has this reverberating effect, this ripple effect over years that you look back on it and see it was like truly transformative. Can you think of any moments like were really transformative? And as you're thinking about that, maybe anything that led you to your current profession, being a professor. What was that initial spark, that initial ripple that caused you from becoming a missionary kid to eventually becoming a professor?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So when I look back, one of the things that I've always tried to do is kind of just follow where I'm being led. In other words, because of my faith, I do believe that God leads us to particular kinds of callings, and that's why I went down to Honduras. And so really when I look at, and let's take Honduras, which was really kind of the first thing that built on my experience overseas. I was working with a Honduran Christian Protestant community development organization, but that was very heavily involved as well on kind of human rights and empowerment, community empowerment approaches. It was at a very difficult time, and because at that point, the Nicaraguan Revolution had occurred. The United States was supporting the dirty war that was being waged against the Sandinistas. So the first death squad starting to appear in Honduras. a lot of protests by popular organizations. So I actually ended up doing a lot of work with this organization and also with peasant labor and human rights organizations. And so when I look back, it's hard to tell anyone's story, but an incredibly formative time of working with colleagues, working with friends, right? Either whose family members were tortured, disappeared, or assassinated. And some of my friends and colleagues fell into that category as well.
Right.
And really being a part of a movement, right, based on our faith to try to do whatever the Lord was calling us to do to resist that. And of course, I was just there, as we say in Spanish, putting my little grain of sand, right? And really, because I was an American, having extra protection, right? You couldn't really touch Americans, right? And that was why in some situations, I was put in some leadership positions of being a more visible face of some of these types of things. So if you take that, right, you take growing up in different cultures, different countries with different languages, take my experience in Honduras, and then fast forward, I actually had to leave Honduras because of that particular work that I was doing. And I had no idea where I was going to go next. Well, the next stop was coaching women's basketball and women's tennis at Swarthmore College. I was qualified for the tennis position probably more than the basketball one. But again, it was just something that God clearly led me there. And there's a whole story behind that. And then from there back to graduate school, right, to try to make sense of my experience in Honduras, what was going on with international development in the rest of the world, what role was religion playing in that. And then from there, being clearly led to the position of a program coordinator with the American Friends Service Committee here in Philadelphia, first coordinating programs in Central America and then the Andean region. And GT, my experience along the way could not have prepared me better for that job, right? Because I was then in charge of supervising our colleagues in Central America and in the Andean region, and knew exactly what they were going through in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, death squads, guerrillas, right? All of that. And thankfully, since I'd lived that life at the grassroots level, I was able to walk with them in a leadership position to support them and support the wonderful work that we were doing, especially with Afro-Colombians, Latin descendants, the population, indigenous populations, and doing a lot of work on U.S. foreign policy through Congress to really try to get some changes to that needed to happen. Then I'm called to Eastern University, right? And to make a long story short, after directing international programs, I go into the seminary. I'm asked to become the interim dean of the seminary. It's supposed to be 18 months. And GT, do you know what the most important experience was that prepared me for that seminary job, in addition to all the other things I've mentioned, was coaching women's basketball and women's tennis. Why or how? It's crazy. Like if I had tried to plan to become a dean of the seminary, for which, again, I was quite unqualified in terms of the content, but I did have quite a bit of management experience by that time. There would have been no way I could have done that. But what happened was the seminary was in a very difficult position. They had suffered a couple of layoffs. They had been uprooted from their campus. And so I come in, and why was coaching basketball and tennis the most valuable experience I had? Because you needed to set clear goals that you could attain, low-hanging fruit very quickly to give, in a sense, to help people to dream again, to have hope again, pep talks that were needed. Just the same things they do with coaching. When I coached at Swarthmore College, they had won one game the year before. We won 3 games the next year, but it was the most wonderful experience because we had very clear goals, all of which we had accomplished, including one where everybody on the team was going to score. And I had 5 players who had never played basketball before, and we're talking about a Division III varsity level. And so all of that just to say, as you asked me the question, what were kind of the influences that kind of led me to my current position, I look now that I'm teaching leadership, and I look back and I think, wow, I am just so thankful for all of these experiences, because now I get to, yes, share with the students who are leaders in their own rights kind of insights that I have, but I also get to continue to learn a ton from them as well.
So a complex system there, a lot of webs. It's not one specific event, but just a confluence of lots of events that just all came together. And then looking back on it in hindsight, you can see clearly how one led to the other, which led to the next.
That's exactly right. Or particular aspects of this that prepared me for particular aspects there. Yeah. Which I could never really have planned out.
So you went through those experiences pretty quick. I just want to camp out on a few of them. So the coaching position. How again did you get from Honduras to a coaching position? Just a little bit of how you got that. That sounds like a big transition.
It was. So I played basketball and tennis at Swarthmore, so I knew people in the athletic department. Again, I had to leave fairly quickly. I'd actually come back for a few months to coach men's and women's tennis in the middle of my time in Honduras because my coach had gone on leave. He asked me to come back to do that. But the basketball, when I had to leave Honduras, I had no idea what I was going to go next. It was very sudden. I had to leave most of the things behind, including friendships. And I actually stayed with my brother, who was a student at Swarthmore, for the first couple of weeks when I came back because I had no place to stay. These positions were open, so I actually applied for. There are 2 basketball positions open, men's and women's basketball. So I applied for both, got rejected from both, and then 2 weeks before the semester started, I got a call from the athletic director who I knew, and he said, "Bronk," that was my nickname. "Would you consider coaching the women's team because all the other candidates have rejected us and we have nobody left?" Wow. Very clear call, right? Wow. And so I had actually played basketball in Honduras as well. So as a player and knowledge of the game, I was fully qualified, but I had never coached before. Yeah. So, yeah.
Bronk, by the way, is that still your nickname?
That some people still call me that, yes.
So it was basically a connection you had. You had a connection with Swarthmore, and you leveraged that connection. You made a choice to apply for the position, and then it's interesting. You were rejected at first, and then they came back to you. So,
GT, I have a whole story of how many times I've been rejected and the way that the Lord has then opened up other positions, or rejected and then actually accepted for something that I had already been rejected for.
We were just talking about that notion of rejection, and we were talking about more broadly about just failure and how failure is a great teacher, and talk about case study after case study of business leaders, entrepreneurs that failed multiple times. We hear the same thing in athletics. I mean, some of the greatest athletes talk about how many times they failed and how that was instrumental in their learning journey.
I think the Eagles, right, will cite that, right? The first failure against the Chiefs and then come back. And I think part of what happens is, at least in my situation, the rejection, I don't think I've ever taken it personally. I think in part, I think because of my faith, it's like, okay, well, God doesn't want me there. I'll just keep praying about where God wants me to go next. And
just open doors and close doors,
exactly.
Basically. Yeah. And so because you went through those 4, between your journey from coach to seminary, there was a couple other steps in there. So what was that immediate next step? I'm going to go a little bit deeper on that.
So I was in coaching, and then I went back to graduate school, which is a whole story of itself. So just very quickly, I had applied to graduate programs the year before, had gotten rejected from all of them. And so continued another year, which...
Theme of rejection again.
Yeah, a theme of rejection, right? And so, but again, I had a clear leading, right, to continue to be a coach, this time full-time coach of the women's tennis team. And we're down in Hilton Head, match is going on. Somebody comes up and taps me on the shoulder and says, "Coach, somebody's on the phone for you." I get on the phone, and who should it be but David Lumsdaine, who is directing the international relations program at Yale, where I had applied. And he basically offered me a full ride, and was recruiting me, which is unheard of for a master's level. He said, full ride for master's plus a stipend. And frankly speaking, what he had spotted was that I was somebody he wanted there. He was a believer. He was a Christian. He wanted other Christians there as well because he felt that diversity would be very important. And so that's, again, a clear leading to there. After graduate school, I didn't...
degree in what?
This was a master's in international relations.
International relations, okay.
And as I'm finishing up that master's in international relations, I have really no idea where I'm going next, but I was recruited into the PhD in anthropology at Yale as well. Okay. Another whole story, right? Okay. I actually deferred for a year. Then I was told, nope, you can't come back. Again, rejected from that, but then that door opened again. Wow. You can kind of see a common theme. Went back for my PhD in anthropology.
Even rejection from Honduras, right? The country ejected you.
Yeah, the people. I would say the people didn't, but the government and military did.
Right.
Oh, GT, I have to tell you, I was doing the full-time community development work with our wonderful organization, and our organization had some links, right, with these popular organizations. And in Honduras, right, when somebody is leaving, you have what's called a despedida, which means a goodbye party, feast. And GT, I was so burnt out from doing those two things at once. And it was, from doing both of those jobs, and it was a very difficult situation, right? Phones were tapped, being followed, right? Threats of violence. And the reason that I was able to get out of the country without having suffered kind of violence like so many of my friends and colleagues was because I was American. I was protected. And that's why we had somebody in that position. But I would wake up just dreaming that I was crying because I missed Honduras so much. I just signed another 2-year contract. I was committed to it. But the interesting thing is I had felt the nudge from, I perceive this to be from God, to go back to school to try to make sense of that experience. So I think on my own volition, I would have never left Honduras. I was just in love with the country, in love with the people, with my friends. I was playing basketball. We had great success there. But this was just kind of the next step that I was supposed to take. Yeah.
So went back. Did you finish the PhD at Yale?
So I finished PhD there. And as I'm coming out, I'm thinking, well, perhaps coaching is where I discovered I loved to teach. I was the shyest kid in high school. I would never raise my hand, or even in college. If I raised my hand, my heartbeat rate would go up to about 200. I would start sweating. I couldn't control my voice. But when I was down in Honduras, what happened was I was serving as a simultaneous translator or a staggered translator for everybody ranging from grassroots groups all the way up to the president. Because one of my position was assistant communications coordinator for this organization, and we were handling a lot of these groups, like your wife participated in. But they were ranging from church groups to all the way up to U.S. congressional groups who wanted to make sense of the difficult situation that was going on. And when you're a translator, you're on. Right. And so you learn to deal with your fear of public speaking quite quickly.
Right.
And that's what happened. Where I discovered that I learned to teach, in addition to that, where I could help explain to groups what was happening and all the different variables that were going into it, was when I was coaching. So my players would ask me a question, and not only could I answer it, I could give them all the reasons for why and have great enjoyment out of it. So that's where I started first thinking, I wonder whether I may be called into teaching. And that would have been unfathomable to me, a few years before. And so when I finished up it took me a while to finish my PhD. I actually had a draft of the dissertation done. So I started to apply first for teaching jobs, was rejected by all of those, and clearly led to the American Friends Service Committee, which I had actually known the Quakers and the Quaker efforts in Central America. We had coordinated somewhat with them. And if I had to sit down to write a job description of my experience in international development and the studies that I had done, that would have been the job that I had written. So it was clear again where I was supposed to go.
Talk a little bit about the mission of the American Friends organization.
So the American Friends Service Committee is actually the social expression of Quakers. So you have the American Friends Service Committee here in the United States. You have Quaker Peace Service that's out of the UK. They have offices in Geneva and in New York for the United Nations. They have a long and storied history, not just of humanitarian relief, but also of a lot of diplomacy work behind the scenes. And they actually received the Nobel Peace Prize for their work during World War II, where they were giving aid to the Germans as well as to others, which many people in Germany still support the American Friends Service Committee because of that. And so the Quaker motto, one of the Quaker, is simply, that there is that of God in everybody. And only about 10% of the staff are Quaker. I'm not Quaker myself, but they're pacifists, known to be pacifists. And they just do absolutely tremendous work. You can imagine, right, seeing that of God in everybody means that they tend to be quite good mediators. Obviously, I don't know, but if you know anything about the Quakers, they were at the heart, right, of the of putting an end to the slave trade, right? William Wilberforce and others, right, kind of, they were the ones kind of behind a lot of that here in the United States, the Underground Railroad and support for that. But we had work overseas. We had work here in the United States through the Quaker region, through the AFSC's regional offices around the United States, and then work through a peace building unit that tried to bring those together to bring pressure to bear on U.S. and foreign policy in terms of the way that it was affecting the rest of the world.
What was your actual title there, role?
It was program coordinator. So we had a Latin America and Caribbean division. I was responsible first for Central America, then the Andean region, but we had work in Haiti. We had work around Cuba. We had work in South America as well.
And obviously your time in Honduras prepared you for all of that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Remind me again how you got from the American Friends organization then to Eastern.
So when I was working with the American Friends Service Committee, we were, I think it's fair to say, quite acknowledged as being at the cutting edge of these this kind of peace, development, relief type work, but especially around kind of the human rights work, the advocacy work that was being done. To make a long story short, a new administration came into the American Friends Service Committee that started questioning especially that advocacy work that we were doing with popular organizations in Central America and in the Andean region. And it got quite difficult. We actually had some external evaluations. Programs started to be cut, so our Central America staff was cut under the guise of certain arguments, which were completely rebutted by an external evaluation that actually found that Central America and the Andean region were probably the most effective programs to accomplish what we were trying to accomplish. And so I started praying about it and started to look to see whether I was being led to other places. So here's a story for you. Mm. When I had joined the American Friends Service Committee, it was just for Central America, and I was supposed to be traveling maybe twice a year for about 3 weeks or so, right, to the region. Then once I assumed responsibility for the Andean region, I actually started traveling probably once every month for 2 to 3 weeks, and we started to have kids. We had 3 young kids. So my wife, Robin, around this time started praying. She prayed for 2 years for less travel for me. At Eastern University, they had an open position for the director of the MBA in Economic Development and the Master's in International Development, right? 2 international development programs. GT, for 2 years, while Ron was praying, they were not able to fulfill that position. They did not find the person. I sent my resume in, and my colleague, Connie Oswald, an economist, received it. She was part of the search committee. And as she tells me the story is she opened the CV, she read it, ran into the office of another one of my dear colleagues, Sharon Granby-Subukwe, and say, this is the man that God has prepared for us, wow. Unbeknownst to me, right? And so I put Robin actually was the one who had spotted that job opening, my wife. And so I applied for it, gave a quote-unquote job talk, and that's how I arrived at Eastern.
How many years now at Eastern?
I'm on my 19th year, and I had never been at any place. We were talking about this. I had never been at any place more. The American Friends Service Committee was the second longest, which was 8 years.
Okay.
So, yeah.
19 years.
And I had no idea how long I was going to be at Eastern. Again, just trying to be faithful for the next step, but here it is. Yeah.
So Eastern, 19 years. You're teaching mostly PhD students, or?
So right now, yep. So right now, after my stint at the seminary, I started teaching in this program. I'm on my 4th year right now. I had always been part of the principal faculty of the program since its inception in 2007, but had never taught in it. So I'd been chairing dissertation committees and things along those lines. Okay. So now I get to be a part of this PhD family fully, where we have just phenomenal students, leaders in their own right, who come in and tend to be somewhat nervous, right, about the academic atmosphere, their academic writing capacities, but I just get to learn from them as I get to share with them, and it's just I just absolutely love it. I'm very thankful for it.
Yeah, go a little bit deeper on that. What gives you the most joy in teaching?
The most joy in teaching for me is getting to have both one-on-one time with students as well as with a group where we're puzzling through something together, right? So if it's in the group, right, generally we're discussing kind of readings that we have all done together and trying to share with each other our perspectives, how that kind of is informed by the theory that we've read, but we always have a practical focus to it, right? So in that sense, we're all learning and we're gaining more insight, right? And sometimes that will lead people to further steps in terms of research and to try to kind of dig deeper in any one particular topic. But the second thing is one-on-one that I love is all of these students have to produce a dissertation, right? A thesis at the end. Yeah. And it's just really brainstorming with them. What are you passionate about? What would you really like to explore? And helping them to narrow that topic to something that they can really sink their teeth into. Right. And then walking with them through that process, the ones that I'm blessed to be able to chair their dissertation committees on, all the way until they graduate. Right. Yeah. So I get to learn so much from their research, right? I get to kind of see the cutting edge work that they were doing and cutting edge work that is quite transformative, both for them as well as for their audiences.
want to go a little bit deeper on kind of aspects of organizational leadership. One is leadership theory, and another is leadership development. Let's talk about those separately. In terms of leadership theory, you've studied dozens of theories of leadership and models. Any particular theory or model or author that stands out as like these people really got it right?
What I would say, it's important to combine all the theories, right? So let's start with one, servant leadership. And that's primarily on my mind because one of the dissertations I'm chairing now that's actually almost done, Jake's almost done on that, is an outstanding theory. It's essential, right? I mean, there's been so many studies done that if you lead as a servant, it has all kinds of positive outcomes. And yet, right, I mean, you have something like a transformational leadership, right, that has other elements to it. And there's overlap between the two, right, but it has some additional insights and some additional emphases. You have collaborative and shared leadership, right, or distributed leadership, which really emphasize, hey, you really want to make sure that you are including people in decision-making processes, right, kind of making sure that their gifts are being used. And so all of those, what I always encourage and try, in the course that I'm teaching is to expose people to all of these different theories. Well, not all of them, but, to a wide range depending on the subject matter, because it's just like research methods, right? There are many ways of being reminded of things that are important that we tend to forget, right? And so you want to have kind of certain checklists. So you always want to make sure you're a servant. You always want to make sure you're collaborative. You always want to make sure that you have an eye open, right, to transformation. Or you always want to make sure you're authentic. And at the root of all of this, I feel, really is relationships, right? Yeah. For me, and that's one of the critiques I have of leadership theory. There are very few that mention love, but for me, it's about loving people. Now, how does love get actualized? You have to hold people accountable, right? You have to make sure you're shepherding processes in such a way that are effective and efficient, that people don't feel that meetings are a waste of time. And so you can play that out. But at the heart of it, if people you're leading, if people you have an influence on know that you love them, that makes all the difference in the world, both
That's
to
powerful.
them and to you.
That's powerful. That certainly applies to what we do here at TLC when we work with our clients. Many of the students and even adult clients that come to us, have, not sure how to say it exactly, but a deficiency of love in their past, a lot of trauma, a lot of the opposite of love, a lot of betrayal. And that is deeply scarring, and it takes sometimes years to unpack that and heal from that. And so love is where we start with the healing process.
Oh, that's so great to hear.
Yeah.
And GT, as you know, I mean, Scripture says God is love, right? And we are supposed to show Christ's love and the embodiment of that. And unfortunately, the church and we Christians are not good at that many times, which is a real shame.
Well, we only have a few more minutes left. I want to shift to the development part of leadership and want to ask a question about if you were advising a young leader. You and I have been in leadership roles for decades. For someone who perhaps is in their first decade, and for example, some of your students are in their 20s and 30s, early 30s. What advice would you give them, say 2, 3, 4, points of wisdom to help them develop to become better leaders? I want to ask that question. And then a lot of our listeners are educators. And then I want to ask the same question for, and you are yourself an educator. What would be 4 or 5 points of wisdom for becoming a better educator?
Yeah, I think probably, I may be wrong, and we'll see how this develops, but I think probably the 4 or 5 points would probably be the same.
Okay.
And I think it would start exactly where we ended off, right? Love, right? So we were just talking over lunch about corporate America, right? And the difficulties that one encounters in terms of the cultures, right, of corporate America. But I'm sorry, I guess I'm an optimist. I think that love can work in corporate America as well. I think that a different model can be identified. I mean, I think back to, think of the way that Tony Dungy, right, coaches versus, well, I won't name names, right? A screamer, right?
Right.
Or an Andy Reid versus a screamer, right? I mean, you can't argue with the results of a Tony Dungy or an Andy Reid, right? So I think many times people think that screaming at athletes, right, getting on their case, instilling fear is the only way to drive them towards outcomes. No, that's been proven not to be the case. So I think there are always alternatives that are a lot healthier, both for the coach, leader, as well as for the athletes, followers, or whatever we want to call them, right? So I think for leadership development, it is first and foremost, love your people. Now, what does that mean? And this is where we get probably into a little bit more of the management and efficiencies, right? Which is you really want to make sure that you help people use their gifts, right? Find a way to make sure that people can use their gifts, the things that they're passionate about, the things that they are good at, right? And how do you do that? Help them dream, listen to them, listen to their ideas. I like to say, I've not really had, I don't know if I've ever had an original idea, but boy, do I love to encourage the ideas of others, right?
Right.
How do you find a way to support the ideas of others, just to kind of give them that encouragement, that incentive? And yes, maybe they might not go anywhere, just as many businesses fail first, but that encouragement to them means so much. And there's a pretty good chance that that idea will flourish into something that you never expected. And I've seen that time and time again. Yeah. So love your people, right? Encourage your people's gifts and ideas, support them. And then I just think a lot has to do with shepherding processes. You don't hold a meeting without concluding it with your takeaways and your next steps. You make sure those next steps are followed up on. You make sure that as you are engaging in whatever it might be, grant writing, reporting on grants, that you have certain structures, right, that really make sure that are organized so you can keep tabs on things, that people are clear about what their roles and responsibilities. We talked about performance reviews, right? I'm a firm belief that you should be giving feedback to people along the way. I also do think that there's probably a good reason, right, for having kind of almost a yearly or bi-yearly check-in, right? How do you feel you're doing? Are there certain ways, communication with us going well, right? So I think those more management things, those will all be. And so when we're looking at educators, I think it's probably the same thing, right? As you develop leaders, right, with all these points, and again, I think love has to be central. The same thing with educators. You love your students. If you're an educational administrator, you love the teachers. You love the people underneath you, quote unquote, underneath you. And the same thing then applies, helping them to use their gifts, right? Maybe with teachers, it's such that, do you have a curriculum that's constraining your leaders from teaching a way that is to their passion? I don't know, right? You can kind of go down the line there. So those are the things that come to mind.
That was great.
Thank you.
And very fast. You're a fast talker.
I am. And so my students sometimes have to tell me to slow down because as I talk and as I get more excited, I get faster and faster. So,
so there's a lot there. And there's a lot there that as you were talking, it's like, ooh, I need to go deeper there. I need to ask about that. I need to ask about that. So we're going to have to do this another time.
I would love to. This is so much fun.
There's so much to unpack there. And maybe it's related to the fact that you've just had all these decades of experience and a lot of wisdom, a lot of rejection, which has led to wisdom, and a lot of that you can then impart to those in the younger generation that are aspiring leaders or educators, counselors, coaches, and ultimately elite leaders. So thank you for your time.
You're welcome. And let me just say something you triggered, which is, yes, I acknowledge that the experiences have given me certain insights. At the same time, I know that I forget a lot of stuff. So I think that humility, if I had to add one thing, humility would be the other thing, right? Which is you always have to be open to say, I missed that, right? And to acknowledge it, to apologize, right? And that hopefully, that I think one of the marks of a really good leader is the ability to apologize, take responsibility, even sometimes for things that weren't directly their fault. But that knowing that, yes, you have a lot of insight, I think needs to go hand in hand with, but I also forget and I also continue to mess up a lot. And I have to make sure that I'm attuned to that. So, yeah.
As you mentioned, loving people and process and the importance of process, I think of the balanced scorecard. Because people is foundational, right? And then you equip the people with great processes. And if you have great people and efficient, effective processes that are customer focused, that leads to customer success, which then leads to financial success.
That's a really good point.
And then when you mention humility, I think of Jim Collins in Good to Great, where he did his study it was multiple years, if not a decade, study of all these different leaders to try to find out what the common ingredient of effective leadership. And of the two common ingredients that he found, humility was one of them.
I forgot that was in From Good to Great. Yeah. I'm going to have to go back and take a look at that. That's a good reminder.
And other researchers have found the same thing. And of course, that's at the heart of many of the leadership theories, like servant leadership.
Right.
And so, it was good. That was good. So thank you so much. You have a great day.
You're welcome.
TLC Connections is supported in part by the Lincoln Center for Family and Youth. Through education, counseling, coaching, and consulting, we empower people to make positive choices, meaningful connections, and transformational change. To learn more, visit thelincolncenter.com.